Hello, and welcome back to our consideration of the Women of Troy. Today we're going to go through the prologue of the play, that is the dialogue, well, firstly, the monologue of Poseidon, then the dialogue between Poseidon and Athene. So, let's get into it. We'll first begin with a line-by-line analysis of the prologue before we make some general observations about this prologue, the ways in which it's unconventional and the way in which that reflects Euripides' purpose and also Euripides as a playwright more generally. So, we begin with this image, the ruins of Troy, a sort of fragment of a sentence, if you like, but it's given a full stop there. It's a decision that Taylor makes. I think it adds to the finality of that sense of destruction. There's no redeeming feature about this, smoking ruin, if you like. Hecuba is lying face down and quite still. There's two things to note there, I think. Firstly, you have Hecuba, this sort of aging grandmother, laying there, enduring this pain, and this is in fact the role of Hecuba throughout this play, as the endurer of pain. She is the one that is forced to be on stage throughout the entirety of it. It's a catalogue of her dialogues. And there's no escape for her. And indeed, even in this prologue, where only the gods are speaking, she too must endure that. And Euripides doesn't let us forget that. It's a very intentional choice, I think. Quite still is also an important stipulation there. That it's not entirely still. She's not a lifeless body, but rather there are these struggles against the inevitability of fate. And yet throughout the play, as is the case here, they turn out to be futile. She's unable to free herself from this sort of prostrated position until the very end of the prologue. And I think it's important then to consider what Euripides chooses to be the backdrop to this conversation between these two divine beings. The backdrop to this conversation is the destruction of Troy. And so as we read this and we see how sort of unfeeling a lot of the dialogue is, how transactional it is, where people are sort of talked about as if they're property, I think it's important then to contextualize that with the horrors that the audience sees in the background, and the disjoint there, the contradiction, the juxtaposition there, I think is very powerful, because it means that we glimpse some of the cruelties that are unanswered for in war, particularly on the behalf of the divine. Cool. So, the beginning of Poseidon's monologue. I think the first thing to note here is the prevalence of the first person singular pronoun. The I have come here from the bottom of the sea. My name is Poseidon. I am a god. I built this city with Apollo. I built it. And there's a real sense of egocentrism here. The self is at the center of all of his considerations of the world. And that's particularly cruel given the destruction of Troy that precedes it. Then he describes these 50 sea nymphs singing in chorus, the daughters of Nereus. And I think this is our first glimpse of a kind of female servitude that runs through this play, whether it's Andromache speaking of Hector as her yokefellow and herself as a mare, or, Helen sort of literally as a suppliant begging Menelaus to not kill her on the spot. There's a real lack of freedom there, right? The dehumanized, or at least like de-individualized 50 sea nymphs in chorus, all the same, all dancing to the same tune, serving Poseidon, this sort of probably the most Homeric of all of the Greek gods. Homeric as in the sort of most masculine conventionally, most brutal. Circle in their intricate and beautiful dance. And I think that's, again, an important image to contrast with what we're seeing. In the background, you have this smoking ruin of Troy that is still, fresh from plunder. And what Poseidon is describing is this sort of very fragile, beautiful dance that he himself witnesses underneath the sea. And there's a real sense of disconnect there, a real lack of empathy, if you like. And I think a nice quote then to draw that to is when Hecuba at the very end of the play describes fate as a kind of madman dancing. And you have these two conflicting images of dancing. The dancing in the divine realm is this sort of calm, intricate, beautiful dance. And yet the dance in the mortal realm is far less glorious, far less desirable than that. Cool. Then we have this interesting fixation, I think. Every stone we laid, every tower. This, I think, establishes what is at stake in Troy's fall. The fall of Troy is a fall of a kind of civilization. It's a fall of humanity, if you like. And I think Euripides is really making an indictment about that. We made this with plumb line and mason square. We give these gods sort of the instruments of man to really emphasize here how difficult it is to erect this kind of civilization, and therefore how tragic its loss is, along with the loss of humanity within it. And then I think the next pivotal word here is the so. So even the walls we dressed and leveled with plumb line and mason square, so I've always had a particular love for this city. His love for this city does not originate from some sense of self. It doesn't originate from something desirable or something praiseworthy. Rather, it originates from his own personal involvement in it. And I think this begins to reveal the selfishness of the gods and the self-centeredness of the gods that is at the center, I think, of what Euripides is trying to say about this prologue. And I think that really comes through. The pitiable, condemnable nature of the gods comes through in that final exclamation, and look at it now, almost as if, a child pointing at a disfigured toy, and angry with it. There's no sense of sort of, the all-encompassing divine power there. No, this is very much quite infantile, quite unremarkable in a way. And I think the kind of petulance that you sense there is also a literal direction to the audience. Look at it now, look at the scene behind me, and compare it to what I'm describing, right? And for Euripides, that's a very powerful contrast, and probably shows how chaotic, despicable the destruction is. A smoking ruin devastated by the power of the Greek war machine. This notion of a war machine, I think, is a very central quote, and it's a nice one to actually begin your essays on, because within the word machine, I think you really sense the amount of depersonalization that soldiers go through in these wars. And if you imagine Euripides' Athenian audience at the time, these sort of, slightly aristocratic people at the festival of Dionysus, I think what he's trying to get across there is, later in the play, when we look at Talthybius, right, and the sort of malleability of human morality, these aren't individual people making decisions on their conscience, but rather they're turned into a kind of cog, and turned within this Greek war machine, this machine that sort of takes in humans, soldiers, people who are, by most accounts, sort of empathetic and caring, and turns them into this really quite despicable form of destruction. And this is the machine that war is in Greece. A Phocian inventor by the name of Epeios, who lived on Parnassus with the skills he learned from Athene, and probably with her help, designed and built a horse whose capacious belly was pregnant with armed commandos, and managed to get it together with its murderous payload inside the walls. The last few lines there, I think, are particularly important. Very interesting juxtaposition between pregnant and murderous. There's a suggestion, or at least a melding, of sort of the images of birth and death, of new life, and the end of it. And to me, it becomes a very grotesque metaphor, therefore, that you're hiding these armed commandos, these insidious agents, inside a belly that's described as pregnant. And in that juxtaposition, in that sort of contrast, that irreconcilable metaphor, we find a real sense of the disconcerting nature of war, and I think Euripides intends that. It's intended to be a thing that's kind of disheartening, and a condemnation of it as sort of corrupting human morality, this thing that is otherwise far more pure, if you like. And then if we jump down, and now the temple gardens are deserted, and puddles of blood smear the sanctuaries of all the gods. King Priam lies dead on the steps of the temple of Zeus, the protector. We get a really rich image here, and it's really the first explicit description that we get of what this destruction in Troy looks like, and it's particularly useful in trying to illustrate that. a few things are interesting, I think. The first is what Poseidon is concerned about. Poseidon is, above all else, concerned about these temple gardens, about the sanctuaries of all the gods, about the temple of Zeus the Protector. These sort of shrines to the gods seem to be of primary concern to him, adding to that sense of self-centeredness. But also, the way in which he describes that blood, the puddles of blood smear the sanctuaries. There's a very sort of violent, sinister sibilance there. First of all, the sort of repeated S sound, but also the way in which the puddles are almost incidental, right? They seem unimportant, described as if they're water. And there's a real dismissal then of human suffering there, and an inability to recognize it to its fullest extent. Smear, on the other hand, I think is far more violent a verb. It gives a sense of the violation of something sacred, a violation of something human within it. I think that's also an extremely important comparison there, that he seems quite fine with human suffering until it defiles something that he finds sacred. And at that point, that is when he deems something immoral. And I think it's a condemnation then of the morality that the gods possess, and therefore the morality under which the Greeks are behaving. Then you have this image of King Priam, the king of Troy, who lies dead on the steps of the temple of Zeus the Protector. The temple of Zeus the Protector is a temple obviously built for Zeus, who supposedly is going to protect the city. And so there's a real sense of tragic irony there, that, sort of falling at his death, Priam is sort of running towards this temple and is on halfway up the temple and gets killed right there. And that is the thread of injustice that to me I think runs throughout this play. That characters who are asking for mercy almost never receive it, and those who are seeking help are never the recipients of sympathy. It's a failure on the Greek part in this play to practice that. But also, there is a complete abdication of divine protection in this play. That is to say, even later on, when Hecuba slowly becomes increasingly disillusioned with the gods and becomes increasingly disillusioned with the degree to which her prayers are working, she says, whether or not you can hear our prayers, and to Zeus, the god who both sits upon and governs over, right, this entire world. There's a real sense of doubt there, a disillusionment with all of the religion that's occurred before, and I think this is the sort of beginnings of that. It's a failure to protect, and it's a real condemnation on the behalf of Euripides. More gold than can be counted, and anything soldiers can loot finds its way down to the Greek ships. Anything is an interesting word there, because that encompasses the women, and that's what these people are reduced to. The Phrygian servants, the Trojan women who will go to Greece and serve their masters, are just quantified as anything. People, individual humans, become loot. And indeed it recalls that stage direction which introduces Andromache, where she is wheeled in with the Styanax on that baggage wagon. And that's all she is, just another piece of baggage to be shipped off. And the sort of inherent, I think, inhumanity there. And then there's this description of the Greeks heading back home and being able to see their family again. But it's described in a tone that I can't help but find quite sinister. So, after 10 years and 10 sowing seasons, they can joyfully set eyes on their wives and children again. Set eyes on is the language of predation. It's a language of hunting, and that's what this is. The relationship between men and women in this society is one which is profoundly unequal, and is one which is informed by a kind of predation and consumption. And that's also the sense that we get with Menelaus talking to Helen. It's the sense that we get with Andromache talking about Hector. There's really no freedom here, and an imbalance, if you like, in the amount of agency afforded to each. As for me, I have been defeated. We return to the centrality of that I have been defeated. The defeat of Troy is a personal one above a communal one. And there's really an inability, I think, to reckon with the degree of communal suffering that has actually occurred in this text on Poseidon's behalf. So, by Athene and Hera, the goddesses, who supported the Greeks and who between them have utterly devastated this city of the Phrygians. Here we get the first introduction of these two goddesses, and I think Taylor intentionally puts emphasis here, puts the word goddesses as the last word of the line, when he could have moved that up and the syntax would be less convoluted. So there's clearly a choice here to emphasize this, and I think it's very important to recognize what kind of a statement this is, which is that we have these two goddesses, women, who are powerful, and yet this power isn't unambiguously good either, even if it is in some way praiseworthy or awe-inspiring, because they utterly devastate the city of the Phrygians. So, I think it recalls the way in which power can be wielded in a way that's both praiseworthy, perhaps noteworthy, but also in a way that is deeply, deeply destructive. Think about Helen, described as a murderess, whether or not that term is appropriate. Think about Cassandra declaring violently, "For I will kill him," and that's her vengeance. Is there something magnificently powerful about that, and does that undercut the sort of norms of subservience and the expectations of subservience? Yes. Is there also something tremendously depraved about that declaration? Also, yes. And so I think here we get the first inkling of that kind of duality. So now I too shall desert famous Troy. This is the untrustworthiness of the gods, the mercurial nature of the Olympian gods, that after supporting Troy for so long, Poseidon, in a whim, says, "I'm done with this city." And to that extent, the gods cannot be trusted in this play, and I think the characters eventually catch on to that. There's also something, I think, inglorious about the word that Euripides chooses here. I too shall desert famous Troy. Whether it's Euripides or Taylor, the choice of connotation there, I think, really exemplifies a kind of criticism towards this desertion, that it's a betrayal of Troy more than it is a choice that Poseidon should be free to take. And all those altars and temples raised in my name, again, we get a real sense of the ego there, that this is what he thinks he's leaving behind, not the people, not the culture, not the people who are supported by this city, but rather the altars and temples. These are the things that, to Poseidon, seem to matter. All worship ceases, and there's no longer anything worth a god's consideration. What then is the rest of this play? The rest of this play is a catalogue of miseries, right? It is an episode after episode of people exploring and explaining the horrors that they're facing. And so, if it is true that there's nothing here left worth of a god's consideration, then what does that make the miseries of the people that we see? It makes them nothing. It diminishes them, and it denies them the legitimacy. So that's a statement that is in some way undercut by Euripides' staging of the play itself, because the gods are a mere prologue, and indeed Poseidon doesn't appear again. But what does get, large amounts of stage time are the exhibition of these miseries. There's a values judgment on the behalf of the playwright here. Those are the things that matter, not what Poseidon thinks matters. Now the riverbank of the Scamander echoes with the screams and moans of captured women. It's a remarkable bit of auditory imagery there. This is a medium, of course. Theatre is a medium where sound matters a lot. And indeed, Euripides makes a lot of use of that. Think about the amount of screeching we hear in the play, the opening lines of Andromache, the ie, right? There's sort of misery that cannot be expressed any other way but through these screeches. And this is what that refers to. The idea of echoing, I think, is so important because it's a reverberation of suffering, an oscillation of a kind of emotional limbo, if you like. And a circularity as well, that the same miseries here today bounce off and return some other time. And if you look at Taylor's poem at the very, very end of this play, rather, you get a sense of that kind of echoing. These same women will reconvene, right? These tragedies, horrors, occur again and again, and I think that's the sort of undertone of Reunion in Sarajevo. There's no hope here. Rather, it's these same moans, these same screams of the captured women, bouncing back and forth, reverberating, and reasserting themselves. Cool. As various Greek lords draw lots for them, I think here, notice the language of transaction and of property and of gambling that's used on these women. Greek lords draw lots for them. Princes draw some. Theseus's descendants get their share. All the women have been allocated. They've been reserved. Polyxena is serving at the tomb of Achilles in payment for his death. A dangerous business. That's what human lives are reduced to, and particularly the lives of women here. They are reduced to merely transactional things that can be gambled upon. People can draw lots for them, and there's a real tragedy there, I think. Then we get the first introduction of Helen, who I think is one of the most interesting characters in this text. And with them, a prisoner like the rest, and quite right too, is the Spartan daughter of Tyndareus, Helen. A few things that are very important to note here, I think. The first is that Poseidon makes a judgment on Helen and says that she is to blame. That becomes a highly controversial statement after what Helen says in this play. But it's important to note that Helen is not believed. Is not believed by Hecuba later on, but is not believed here from the outset. We are set up to dislike Helen. Is the Spartan daughter of Tyndareus? We use a patronym here. A patronym is when a person is referred to in reference to their father, right? So the daughter of Tyndareus. This is the way that women are defined. They're defined by their male relations, and those are the features which separate them from each other in this play and in the context of Athenian Greece. But to see the true face of misery, you need look no further than the poor creature lying there in front of the gate. There's something quite disconcerting to me, at least, about the way in which that is phrased. You need look no further. It's as if it's a kind of sales pitch. There's a very sinister, depraved reveling in the suffering that he's witnessing. And I think you get also that sense in poor creature, lying there in front of the gate. She's sort of stripped of all humanity. She's a mere creature, a kind of beast at a zoo exhibit that, Poseidon's pointing to and saying, hey, look, that's the long-suffering Hecuba. And again, adds to the sort of sense of depravity and detachment and the lack of empathy of the gods. I mean, it's pertinent these moments to think about what the backdrop is. The backdrop is Hecuba lying there on the ground, but also the smoking ruins of Troy, and how there's a real detachment there, a real inability to explain the gods' lack of empathy in that moment. Lying there in front of the gate, I think the gate is also important imagery, that it is the symbol of the protections that have failed, the protections that Poseidon, when he built those walls, had promised to protect. And this is the betrayal of the gods in this play, whose unnumbered tears match the numberless dead. Few things. Firstly, notice the paralleling of imagery there, unnumbered, numberless, or rather paralleling of quantity, I should say, there, unnumbered with numberless. Really suggests a sense of connection there. Hecuba is capable of empathy. And the second thing to note there is the number drowned will be beyond counting. That's what Athene says later on, right? And you get a real sense then of the circularity of plot here, that Hecuba right now is weeping for the numberless dead, but soon afterwards, Hecuba is the one, Athene is the one who's promising to drown an unnumbered amount of Greeks on their return home. And so there's no escape of suffering. This play is not the end, and the Trojan War isn't the be-all and end-all. Rather, it's just another step in this sort of terrifying trajectory of more and more pain and more suffering. Her daughter, Polyxena, has been secretly and brutally murdered. Notice that there's something very shameful about this brutality, that it has to be done secretly, in the same way that the dangerous business of Agamemnon taking Cassandra as his concubine is a business best kept in the dark. There's no glory to this, and Euripides recognizes that, and in fact the characters themselves recognize that, and that's why they sort of hide from it in a way. At the tomb of Achilles, in payment for his death, again, this language of transaction reoccurs. The frenzied visionary, whom even the god Apollo left untouched as a virgin, Agamemnon intends to make his concubine. Notice there the description of frenzy, because that, to me, as a word, encapsulates what Cassandra is. Behind that word frenzy is power. It's immense power, and it's a kind of liberation. It's a kind of letting loose, but also it's a sense of immense destruction and pain and difficulty. And those two things are the things that Cassandra, as a character, demands that we try to reconcile. And in fact, I think it's likely that a Cassandra topic will come up sooner or later. And I think if you're able to unpack that duality, it makes for very interesting analysis. Whom even the god Apollo left untouched as a virgin. There's a sense of entitlement there to me. That there implies that there's a right that Apollo has. It's unusual for Apollo to leave some girl unravaged. Well, that's a real condemnation then on the sort of moral compass of these gods and of Greek society more generally. But also notice juxtaposition there. Untouched as a virgin, Agamemnon intends to make his concubine. This is a sacred thing destroyed, in the same way that humanity as a sacred thing is destroyed, in the same way that conscience in Talthybius, for instance, is destroyed. This is another pure thing destroyed, and I think you can draw those links. Dangerous business, best kept in the dark. Well then, most prosperous of cities, of the rich and fortunate, shining towers and citadels. This is what he says farewell to. This is, Poseidon intends to say goodbye, but Athene will later on intervene. But, if this is a farewell, these are the things that he chooses to farewell. And there's a real sadness there, I guess, that there's no mention of people. Rather, it's a pure focus with material wealth and with the things that are material and measurable and the objects of worship towards him. Notice also that the descriptions of Hecuba run through line breaks here, that they run across lines, and there's a real sense of that protracted suffering that extends over time, that is quite troubling. Then enter Athene. May our old antagonism be forgotten. You are the brother of my father, great god, as you are, whom other gods honor. This is a bold claim. It's a sense of capital G greatness. I don't just mean that on the page. I mean, this is sort of, enshrined as this image of greatness, if he is the great god. And yet it seems to be entirely undercut by what we hear before. There's no glory in the depiction of Poseidon in the preceding lines. There's no greatness to be found there. And so it's a condemnation also on what the Greeks find to be great. There is nothing great about that kind of divine indifference, even if it embodies a kind of stoicism that the Greeks find praiseworthy. And I think it's important to recognize that. I think it's a comment by Euripides on what greatness is. We are blood relations. There's an appeal to family in a play that is about the destruction of families, is about the throwing of Hecuba's grandson Polyxena off the battlements, and the killing of an innocent child because of a vote by the Greek council. And so there's a real irony there, I think, in retrospect, at the very least. The question at issue some new dispensation. These are all euphemisms about the war. It's almost as if Athene can't face the war directly, or either of the gods can't face the war directly. They can't reckon with that suffering honestly, and so instead talk about it in these sort of vague terms that gesture towards what the truth might be. No, it concerns Troy. I want to make a pact. How ironic then are the acts of, are the betrayals of trust when, the gods themselves are asking for this kind of a pact. My former enemies, the Trojans, will be comforted. What comfort? This is an interesting curiosity about the play that Euripides stages. The Greek people know the ending of the Iliad, and they know the Odyssey. So they know how this story ends. There's no ambiguity there. So, and there's never a reprieve. Hecuba never gets vindicated. There's never a moment of catharsis in this play. But also, more generally, there's not a moment of catharsis for the Trojan women after they're taken away. And so, it becomes a question. This is just a kind of dismissal. My former enemies, the Trojans, will be comforted. A sort of throwing away of suffering in favor of just saying, well, yeah, at some point we'll fix it. And it's really quite shameful in that sense. Then Poseidon says, a cavalier change of mind. That word cavalier really suggests a kind of disregard, a kind of, push through mentality of that throws away any sense of humanity that may remain. I've been insulted, my temple desecrated. That echoes to me so much of what Poseidon says before, and look at it now, right? There's kind of infantile anger that you get from the gods. It's a very unconventional portrayal. I think part of it is Taylor's translation. He sort of adds a bit of that in, but also part of it is Euripides' play. It suggests that the gods aren't these sort of all-glorious beings, but rather these people that are easily angered by affronts to their egos, by affronts to their reputations, and really quite self-centered and concerned with image in a sort of vain way. Then we get probably the most horrific euphemism in the text. When Ajax dragged Cassandra from the sanctuary, the rape of Cassandra is one of the great injustices of Western literature. And Poseidon sort of describes it as dragged. I think if you're asked to make commentaries on the treatment of women in these plays, just the way in which the horrors can't be borne out because people are unwilling to confront them speaks to how confronting they are, and speaks to how great an affront to humanity they are. The Greeks did not punish him. This is Athene's outrage. There's no retribution. And it speaks to the retributive nature of these gods. This is what they care about. They want punishment, and yet it's not delivered, and so there is anger. When your power had enabled them to bring Troy to its knees, a personification here of Troy as a city as if it's a person literally brought to their knees. And also, again, I think, builds a sense of pathos for Troy as an entity that's about to be lost, and it's quite powerful in that way. Finally, you get Athene. When they left Troy and are nearing home, Zeus promised me a savage hailstorm, torrential rain, gale-force winds, mountainous waves. This is an image of abject horror, and yet she seems to revel in it. This is the second time that we see this sort of grim reveling in a sense of power and in a sense of impending destruction. Similarly, you'll get that, I think, later on when Talthybius talks to Andromache and says, take this on like the queen you are quite without any power to stop us. We can deal with a single woman. And this is, the same kind of grim relishing in power and in the abuse of it that we get here. And it's a recurring theme, I think, in this text. And he's given me the use of his thunderbolts to strike the Greek ships with lightning and burn them at sea. The juxtaposition, or the oxymoron rather there, gives you a sense of the chaos. To burn something at sea, all the elements are sort of enclosing on these people. But also note, then, with mountainous waves and to some extent the gale force winds, the way in which that affects Hecuba or characters like that. Hecuba says in the beginning, "O sway, flow lifted by the gentle rocking of a boat." Elsewhere she says, "We must not breast a running tide with our fragile prow." There's a metaphor of self, of the Trojan women as this kind of vessel that has to be steered. And within that, she says, and within that there's a desire for a sort of gentle journey, right? A gentle bearing out of fate, this sort of common nautical metaphor that occurs a lot in Greek theatre when discussing fate. And yet we know now from Athene's monologue that they're going to be denied any of that. They're going to face these gale force winds and mountainous waves. There is no safe fate available. It's kind of foreshadowing, if you like. Then the rest, and swirl and eddy the salty waters with dangerous whirlpools. The circular movement of that water is so important, because if we take the nautical metaphor as a image of fate, which is sort of the accepted interpretation here, then that swirling, that eddying, those whirlpools are this sort of circular movement of that water, a sense of the cycle of destruction that doesn't end, and that is the ultimate message of this play, especially in Taylor's translation, because he does pay so much attention at the end to his poem, or rather, like, he adds his poem at the end, Reunion in Sarajevo, a sort of statement on how these histories keep repeating themselves. And if that is the case, which I intend that it is, then that swirling, that eddying, is that sense of history being circular, and returning to the same place, and an inability to progress. Floating with corpses so thick you could walk on them. It's just a very nice quote, I think, to capture the tactility and the viscerality of the horror that is experienced. They will learn their lesson in future. Respect my temples and fear the power of the gods. This is a relationship that the gods want the people to have with them. And it's an important observation, I think, to make if you're asked to talk about the gods. It's a sense of awe. It's a sense of simultaneous fear and respect, and it's profoundly unequal in this play. And I think the characters recognize that and resent it to a great extent. Athene, you need not waste more words. I shall do that with pleasure. A real juxtaposition between pleasure and the horrific scenes that have just been described. But also, and quite importantly, I think, if it is done with pleasure, we get this pause, the full stop in the middle of the line of Caesura. And we're forced to reckon with that, I think. Forced to reckon with the fact that Poseidon will enjoy inflicting this damage on them. And really the foregrounds of depravity that is in there. We've talked about the sort of bodies beyond counting, matching Hecuba's numberless tears and the numberless dead, rather unnumbered tears and the numberless dead. And then we get this final image of petulance. This is inserted by Taylor. In other translations, it's not as sort of infantile and childlike. He's asking for trouble. The same destruction sooner or later will fall on his own head. This is the cyclicism of war. And we've arrived at, if you like, a sense of finality, even if it is not a resolution of conflict. That is to say, even if the sort of core problems in the plot do not resolve, this is a projection of the future, that the same outrages that get carried out here will keep on repeating themselves until the end of time. Cool. So that's the line-by-line analysis of the prologue. Hopefully that was of some use. I'm now going to just make some remarks on the prologue as an entity, because I think it's a bit unusual, and I think it's worth us dedicating a bit of attention to it. So in Greek theatre, the prologue is a portion of the play that occurs before the chorus enters the stage. And in general, the prologue will in some way bring about the context of the play and often foreshadow some things in order to sort of enact a kind of dramatic irony. Euripides himself, Greek theatre, first of all, is sort of dominated by a set of norms and by a set of traditions. Most of them are, or some of them are set out by Aristotle in Poetics, where he describes the conventions of tragedy. And the conventions of tragedy consist of a sort of clear beginning, middle, and end, where you kind of have a setup, you have a conflict, a fatal flaw that a hero has, then there's a realization of that flaw. There's this moment where suddenly everything becomes clear, realization. It's often called peripeteia. And then suddenly, after that moment of realization, you get some form of catharsis, whether it is sort of in abject tragedy or in abject joy, the sort of pent-up pathos, the pent-up empathy that the reader has or the audience has is sort of released. That's what the ideal tragedy by Aristotelian standards are. Euripides himself was an unconventional playwright. He sort of subverted conventions frequently. And this prologue, though, even among Euripides, is counted among the more unusual ones. It's unusual for a few reasons. It's unusual, firstly, because it doesn't have a form of complication, because it's dealing with a story that is so well known that no member of the audience would have any ambiguity about how this story ends. They know how the Trojan War ends. So this play, and the prologue, therefore, must cater towards an audience who already knows the plot, but instead this play is filling in the gaps of the voices that are unheard. And to that extent, this prologue then doesn't carry across the same forms of foreshadowing that normally needs to. It doesn't need to build towards or facilitate the same sense of catharsis that is necessary, because the story of the Iliad and the story of the Odyssey by Homer are so well known. Instead, and this is what a critic points out, a critic called Francis Dunn, is that this is kind of more like an end to the play. It's an end that contains a prophecy, where the gods bid a kind of goodbye, and where there is a moral that is very explicitly stated at its end. These are things that typically happen at the play's conclusion. In fact, in many of Euripides' plays, you have sort of a beginning where the gods are talking, or a single god is talking typically, and then an end where that same god returns and then draws out the conclusions of the play in terms of morality. Euripides' Women of Troy has no end of that variety. So, in fact, the end comes at the beginning. And I think that's particularly powerful. One, because it creates a sense of circularity and it sort of emulates that very sense of cyclic violence that the play itself tries to express. But secondly, because it allows for us to finish on the image of the chorus marching off, knowing what's going to happen to them, that there is no happy ending, that the marching was for nothing insofar as they don't, one day come back to Troy and see it built up again. And so we know that won't happen, but we're allowed to rest on the image of them hoping that it will happen, having been told what the reality is from the very beginning. And there's something very, very powerful in that, I think. And I think that's what Euripides is trying to play with there. So, I think it's particularly notable, and I'll quote for you portions of it. Euripides' farewell at the end of the prologue, and I think you get a sense of the finality here. Well then, most prosperous of cities, home of the rich and fortunate, it's time to say goodbye, shining towers and citadels, farewell forever. These are words of goodbye. These are, bidding the audience farewell in a way. And equally, when Poseidon departs, he makes this remark about morality, and it's a sweeping generalization that would typically, again, come at a play's conclusion. When a man sacks a town and destroys everything, even sacred temples and the tombs of the dead, he's asking for trouble. The same destruction will sooner or later fall on his own head. And this is the moral of this story to Poseidon, not perhaps to us. And by foregrounding that cyclicism, by foregrounding that circularity in violence, It says, well, the rest of this play is part of that cycle, and it allows us to contextualize the play in that fashion. And I think it's important to recognize the role of this prologue in doing that, rather than more conventionally sort of giving historical context or background to this play, which is unnecessary in Euripides' case. Finally, I'll read you two excerpts from critical readings that I think summarize this quite well and better than I could. The first comes from that Francis Dunn article. The finality of the prologue, which suggests that the plot is finished rather than about to begin, focuses attention in the following scenes upon human agents and upon how they cope with their dead-end situation. The lack of finality in the epilogue heightens this pathos. The suffering of the Trojan women is relieved by no divine intervention or redeeming prophecy. It is not even rationalized by eitology or moral. I think that's particularly important. And it's particularly important because it explains why it is then that this play and the staging of these women is quite remarkable, because there is no plot reason to do it. They're not building to anything. There's no hope that's available in the first place. But instead, as Conacher notes, the only movement in this play is a rhythm of hope and despair. Again and again, this hope is stamped out and gives way to desolation, only to flicker forth in some new place until its final quenching at the end of the play. And that's what this prologue does. It tells us there will be finally the dousing of hope at the end with water, and there will be nothing left. But it allows us to view those flashes of hope in the context of that. And in later videos, we'll discuss what the implications of that are then, when there are these flashes of hope that we know won't amount to anything. And I think that hits precisely on why this prologue is so unconventional, and why that unconventionality is important, because it gives context to the rest of the play. We understand the rest of this play will be building to nothing, and yet it's still remarkable and necessary and worthwhile regardless. All right, hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.